Hello and welcome to the 2024 ASCLD Train the Director webinar series in collaboration with the FTCOE. Today we will hear from Jean Peters, Chief of Forensic Science Research at the FBI Laboratory, on FBI Laboratory Decision Analysis Studies in Pattern Evidence Examinations.
Good afternoon. This is Jean Peters from the FBI Laboratory in Quantico, Virginia. Can I get a sound and video check, please?
Looks and sounds good, Gene. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, everyone, for joining our talk this afternoon. I'd like to talk with you today about research that we have been conducting at the FBI Laboratory in conjunction with all of your laboratories to examine how pattern evidence decisions are made by your forensic examiners. By way of background, this is my opinion only and not an official position of the FBI Laboratory or the U.S. government. The standard disclaimer for federal employees. The FBI Laboratory does have a dedicated research group. We've been in existence for almost 40 years now. Our main role is to develop new capabilities, new ways of analyzing evidence that we don't currently have, as well as to improve existing methods of examination if we can make methods better, faster, more sensitive, lower limits of detection. But increasingly, we have found that our research portfolios have been driven by the need to improve the scientific foundations of forensic science and strengthen the admissibility of testimony and forensic examination, particularly as it relates to pattern evidence examinations. So our research objectives in doing this have been to assess the reliability of pattern evidence examinations in what we call decision analysis studies. These are often referred to as black box studies, and we have published numerous papers presented at many conferences, at American Academy meetings, IAI, as well as judicial conferences as well, to describe the results of our research. In general, we want to look at the accuracy of examiner decisions, the error rate for the pattern evidence examinations in terms of how often they get those decisions right. Other key components of that research are to look at the repeatability of examiner decisions and the reproducibility of examiner decisions. Repeatability is when we re-examine the same evidence and see if we reach the same conclusion. Reproducibility is shuffling the deck of the samples that we send out to pattern evidence examiners and assess how well the field gets consensus on them. And I'm going to talk about all this in great detail. I want to go back a slide. The images you see on the right are from our 4 major studies that are published on fingerprints, firearms, footwear or shoe prints, and handwriting. Some milestones in how the research came about. This really started with the Madrid fingerprint misidentification, which was subjected to review by the Department of Justice Inspector General, who issued some reports in 2006. And that catalyzed our fingerprint study, which began in 2007. We all know the National Academy of Sciences report in 2009. Our first fingerprint paper was published in 2011 in Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. Got a lot of attention. From those, we used the basic experimental design and what we learned from those studies to initiate a firearms study in 2012 and a handwriting study in 2015. And then finally, our shoe print or footwear study in 2016. So that's sort of an overall picture of the milestones of our work. What we strive for in this is to reach a broad cross-section of each discipline. In each of those 4 major areas, fingerprints, firearms, handwriting, and shoe prints, we want as many participants as we can get to work in our studies, participate with our sample sets, our research sample sets, and return those to us. And in doing that, we want to achieve a broad sampling of levels of experience, training, certification, qualification, and we collect metadata about all of those factors. It is critical that we have broad participation from research for our research projects. And we've had more than 500 examiners from federal, state, local crime labs, and even some private practitioners. So we absolutely could not have done this research without the participation of laboratories like yours. We often get asked, how are these different than proficiency tests? Our research samples that we send out to the participating examiners, whether they are in digital form or physical form, are generally more challenging than casework samples. And there's also many more of them, so it becomes very time-consuming compared to proficiency tests. These are resource-intensive projects, required significant multi-year funding for the FBI. We did have support from the National Institute of Justice for a portion of it as well. And that multi-year funding is always a challenge for publicly funded laboratories like ours because we operate on one-year money. So we have to make sure that our executive management understands not only the need for the study, but the need for continuing funding in out years because we don't want to terminate these studies early. All these projects are led by FBI laboratory staff. We have dedicated research scientists complemented by casework and discipline subject matter experts. And as I said, thanks to you all and your laboratory examiners, we've had more than 500 external participants across all 4 studies. And of course, the logistics of executing these research studies are very complex. The black box nature, and I'm sure many of you have heard this before, that reflects the independence of the methodology used. When we send our samples to participating examiners, they use whatever standard methods and SOPs are used in their laboratory. So we're not asking them to conduct their comparison examinations in a manner different than what they are accustomed to. Throughout the talk today, I'm going to talk about some of our major design considerations and also many of the criticisms that we have received or critiques, questions that we've got. So one of our major considerations is the number of participants. How many participants can we get to work with our studies, and how can we make it as representative of the discipline as a whole? This is a challenge because there is no registration of all qualified forensic examiners in any discipline. Another key component is all of our participants are human subjects for the purpose of research protections. So all 4 of these projects have been overseen by the FBI's Institutional Review Board for the Protection of Human Subjects in Research and afforded all those protections, including privacy, anonymity, and not having their results disclosed to them so that we don't create any giglio material. When we design these studies, we focus on how many samples we're going to ask each participant to compare and examine, and how many decisions we will get, because that forms the statistical power from which we draw our conclusions. We evaluate whether it is practical to use physical samples, as we did in some of the studies, versus digital samples. The physical samples are more realistic and representative of casework. The digital samples are easier from a logistic perspective to coordinate, distribute, return. We look at how much metadata we can collect, and we assess how difficult our samples are. And I apologize for the typo in the bullet there. We want them to be as representative of challenging or difficult casework as possible. If it were possible to achieve a well-defined happy medium of difficulty in casework, if we had some way to measure that, even if we had that exact 50th percentile, we would want to say that our results bound the reasonable range of difficulty in casework. So we intentionally design these studies samples to be at the upper end of casework difficulty, so that when we get figures of merit like decision rates, error rates, we want them to bound the realistic casework scenarios. And we do that through maximizing the use of close non-matched samples, and we'll talk about how we achieve that in each of the 4 studies. We want the studies to be as blind as possible. We, as scientists, think of blindedness in a clinical trial in which participants are not aware of whether they're getting a placebo or an experimental drug. Obviously, we can't really do that as well as would be done in a clinical trial, but we try to make them as close to a double-blind, pseudo-double-blind as possible, in which case the participants know that they are working on research samples, but the experimental team does not know who the participants are, nor can we correlate results to specific participants. And the participants obviously do not know the ground truth. They don't have the correct answer key for the samples that they are examining. In most of these fields and most of the disciplines, there has been a lot of previous research. When we look through those bodies of work, we try to improve where we can and optimize the design as much as possible. And one of the things we focus on is open set balance design, so that one cannot infer an answer through a process of elimination. Certainly, data management, analysis, and presentation is always an important factor. Another key component for us in designing these studies is what decision scale to use and how to harmonize them across the discipline, particularly when there is no standard used by every examiner in the discipline. We see that in some of the firearms studies, some of the participating laboratories require the use of a binary scale. It's either an identification, and if it's not an identification, it is an exclusion. At the other end of the spectrum, we see 7 and 9-point decision scales, where there is the incorporation of uncertainty through the use of inconclusives kind of in the middle of the scale. And that leads to another key component, and that's how we treat inconclusives in the results. We're going to talk much more about that later. That metadata management analysis is an important part. And then the final note, and this is important, another important component of creating that bounding error rate, is that we ask our participants to work alone. That unlike casework, which most laboratories have as part of their quality system, some form of secondary review, a tech review, a verification, and so forth, we ask that that not take place in our research samples, because we want the results to reflect the work of an individual examiner, not a team effort. We believe that should those secondary reviews take place, they would reduce errors even further. So again, just to reiterate, our goal is an upper bound estimate of decision rates, whether they're false positive, false negatives, negative predictive value, positive predictive value, and so forth. So I will walk through the design elements for our 4 major studies relatively quickly. Again, these have all been presented on at numerous conferences and in publications in the past, but our first study was the latent print decision analysis study. In this project, we used digital images of fingerprints to send out to our participating examiners. They were given 100 pairs of images each and asked to make comparison decisions. Without going into the detail of the decision schema there, we had a total of 744 different image pairs that we could reassemble to send out to our participants. They were created using difficult substrates to increase that level of difficulty. We had 169 participants who collectively made more than 17,000 comparison decisions. And in terms of false positive and false negative rates, we see the false positive rate 0.1%, false negative 7.5%. Now, again, that's based on absolute decisions over all decisions made. And we published 21 papers to date on that project. The firearms study, which is getting probably the most attention right now, given the interest in the court system on firearms examination. Again, this started in 2012. We published our first paper in 2022, summarizing the accuracy rates. And this was based on more than 40,000 physical samples of bullets and cartridge cases. These are water tank test fires. I can tell you I've fired a fair number of them. It was an excellent stress reliever on a Friday afternoon. We used 49 different pistols, a Beretta model, M93, a Ruger, and a Jimenez. Again, trying to bracket the range of casework type samples, the Jimenez being kind of a less expensive, lower market model. The Beretta was chosen because of its falling breech design in order to maximize the difficulty. Now, we frequently get comments like, well, aren't Glocks used in casework, in crimes quite a bit? That's certainly the case. But for those of you who are in the firearms business know that polygonal rifling renders them not really well suited for comparison decisions like we are asking these examiners to make. Another way in which we increased the level of difficulty for this was to use steel-cased ammunition rather than the much more common brass. Brass, being soft, relatively soft, takes tool marks from the firing process much more readily than does steel ammunition. So the steel's not going to mark as well. That makes the comparison process more difficult for the participating examiners. And then finally, we use consecutively manufactured barrels and slides. Our principal investigator for this project, Keith Monson, spent more than 2 weeks at the Beretta factory in Tennessee, tracking each individual barrel to be used in our study, and the slides as well, through the entirety of the manufacturing process, rather than simply relying on the manufacturer's numbering system to assess consecutive manufacturing. We also sampled throughout the tool life when barrels are formed. Obviously, the machining process leaves the features that create the tool marks on the bullet itself. And for Berettas, that's done through a broaching process in which a disc is pulled through the barrel to create the rifling. Well, first to smooth it and finish it, and then to create the rifling. And we sampled throughout the broach tool life to be able to bracket the range of difficulty in the manufacturing process and how that carries through to the firing process. We had 173 participants making more than 20,000 decisions. Again, this has been widely reported on, but you can see the accuracy rates. 0.66% false positive for bullets, false negative 2.87, for cartridge cases 0.93 and 1.87 respectively. And again, these are the decisions where a definitive decision was made, not including inclusives over all decisions in the denominator. And we published a couple of papers to date on this, and we have a couple more in progress. Our handwriting study, we used digital samples, images of handwriting exemplars. We had intended to use physical samples, but that became logistically too challenging to manage. Historically, handwriting analysis had been fairly well accepted in the court until a Wisconsin court decision, the Johnstead decision in 2014, questioned the previous research about the reliability on handwriting examinations because it had all been done in old-fashioned cursive writing. And the court opined that it was not clear if that prior research, even as efficacious as it was, would apply to more modern styles of handwriting. So for this study, we included a mix of printed handwriting, cursive handwriting, and mixed natural writing styles. If you were to look at my handwritten notes, you could infer no distinct pattern because I switch back and forth between print and cursive all the time. And many people do. And so the courts question whether or not prior research that focused exclusively on the features associated with cursive handwriting would still apply with more modern handwriting samples. We created 180 separate question and known reference samples. Again, to make it more difficult, we included writing samples from identical homozygotic twins, figuring that was from a genetic perspective as close as we could arrange for samples to be similar. And one of the other factors in handwriting examination is the amount of writing available with which to make a comparison decision. So we varied the amounts of writing from the equivalent of the address on an envelope to full-page free text writing. which included the traditionally used London letter as well as writing from free text prompts. We gave our participants, our donors, if you will, opportunity to write their own text. We had 86 participants. Now, even though that's a smaller number than we saw for the fingerprint firearms studies, there are many fewer handwriting examiners in criminal forensic laboratories, so we feel this is a much larger proportion of the handwriting examiner community. And those participants collectively made about 6,600 decisions. And you can see below, again, false positive, false negative rates, 3.1, 1.1%, respectively. And we published a single paper that included the accuracy, the repeatability, and reproducibility results. Our shoeprint or footwear study, again, we use digital images. We have a unique collection of footwear here at the FBI that we scanned, photographed, and did electrostatic lifts on. And most of the samples came from what we call the FBI boot collection. We feel particularly strongly about this because it is a unique collection of footwear because it was all the boots, roughly 700 or so, were worn by new FBI agent trainees here at the FBI Academy in Quantico, Virginia, during the roughly 6-month duration of their training with us. Some of the footwear features that made these unique is they were hiking boots, so they've got lugs on the outsole, but it was a scalable outsole design so that each shoe, regardless of its size, had the same number of lugs. So they would vary in size, but it would always be the same number of lugs. And then because they were all new agent trainees, they wore them for the same duration, same amount of time, performed the same activities in the same geographic location. In addition to those samples, we had other more common footwear samples like athletic shoes, sneakers. We had a marathon runner who wore the same model of shoe over and over again throughout the course of their training. So we had a really interesting collection of physical samples that we could image and use in this study. Again, we had 84 participants, also we believe, fairly significant proportion of shoeprint examiners across the United States. Again, making 6,000 some odd decisions, false positive, false negative rates, 0.2 and 6%. What we find in all of these studies is that errors are generally made by a small subset of participants. Clearly, with numbers that are in the single-digit percent numbers and below are by definition a small subset. But even within that, we found that in some cases, a single examiner might make multiple errors, disproportionately influencing the error rate relative to the number of examiners in the study. And again, I could talk for an hour or two about any one of these individual studies. I'm sure you'll note that I'm not including the repeatability or reproducibility numbers because that's a much more nuanced discussion. All of this has been published in the scientific literature and is available. We also try to make as much of the underlying data available as well for other researchers to use. So let's talk a little bit about the responses that we've gotten to some of these studies. You might have noticed in the previous table that in addition to publications, we respond to letters submitted to the editors of the journals in which our work is published. As critics opine about our work, we do try to respond in the literature as much as we can. At conferences, we look for and welcome the dialogue about these studies. We understand they are not perfect. There are always ways in which a study can be improved. We try to close as many of the experimental design gaps as we can, but there's always going to be room for improvement. And so we welcome this critical dialogue about how we can make forensic science more well-structured and increase the scientific foundations. So one of the first criticisms we've gotten was about the selection of participants. Now, I try to carefully avoid saying that our samples, our participants are, quote, representative of the discipline in a statistical sense. They are not, because they were not randomly selected from the population of examiners in the United States and abroad. That would be a great thing to do, but again, we don't know them all, and so we can't statistically sample. And more importantly, even though there are definite uncertainties or questions associated with a non-random convenience sample, so-called selection bias, which is an important part of all research in which participation is voluntary and opt-in rather than a randomly selected subset, is for us, because we are treating our participating examiners as human subjects, federal law requires us to obtain informed consent and that participation be voluntary. So there's a logical contradiction there. If participants volunteer and self-select in, then by definition, that becomes a non-random sample. So we can't say that these are representative of the examiner population, but we also don't have any information to suggest that they're not. And so this volunteer bias is one of the points that we often hear about in terms of the study design. But short of enrolling all participating examiners in a study, which would then make it less voluntary, we have yet to find an effective way to solicit for participation independent of that. The next two major bullets really go together, the Hawthorne effect and non-blind testing. For those that are not familiar, Hawthorne effect is a phenomenon really that kind of comes from that late 19th century, early 20th century time and motion studies for industrial organization and effectiveness. And what the researchers in going into factory settings and assessing how well factory workers did their job, how much time they spent on a given task and so forth, they found that people behave differently when they know they're being observed, right? I think we can all relate to that in some way or another. And the question then is, do participants give greater diligence when they know this is a research sample or less diligence to these types of studies? I think you can make an argument for either case. Some have opined that because of the importance of these studies to admissibility and the discipline as a whole, that participants are more inclined to give greater attention and diligence to the research samples than they might in corresponding casework. I think the corresponding perspective is that while these studies are important for the discipline, they are not real casework. Nobody's life or liberty is pending on the outcome of that comparison that they're making. No way to prove one way or the other which is true. I personally feel that most of the time this is going to be compensating phenomena. Some individual participants might give greater effort, some might be less so. We do know from some of the metadata we've collected that participants in these studies tend to break it up and not work on it in a single contiguous block of time. They might be more inclined to do so for real casework. In a perfect world, we would have loved to have done this as a blind test, mitigating that Hawthorne effect. But unlike blind proficiency testing, which is generally done by an individual laboratory within its own internal framework, we're all familiar with Houston Forensic Science Center and the great job they do with their blind proficiency testing program. Given the large number of laboratories participating in our research studies, it was impractical to come up with experimental samples that would look like each of those laboratories' chains of custody, packaging, and marking. That was just not a practical thing. We had somewhere between 60 and 70 individual labs represented in our studies, so trying to make each one of those look like its own internal work would have been much too difficult. And we were also very concerned about the risk of having our samples mixed up with regular casework. Other criticisms we've heard that opinions that it was easy to, or one could cherry pick easy samples. We don't feel that this is a valid criticism because the samples were not organized by difficulty. They were either presented randomly or in a random sequence, and the participants could not go back and change. And again, each of our studies was a little bit different, each of the 4, 5, if you include our most recent latent print study. So it would have been very difficult for someone to pick only the samples that they considered easy. Kind of related to that point, that I discussed earlier about not being representative of casework, that is certainly true. We focused on challenging and difficult samples deliberately by intent to create that upper bounding rate of decision, category of decision rates. There are also no universal or quantitative measures of difficulty for many of these disciplines. As an outgrowth of our work in the footwear study, we did propose a semi-quantitative scheme of rating difficulty of casework for shoeprints. But absent something like that, there is no universal measure that we could use to define a level of difficulty. And furthermore, what's difficult for one person might not be difficult for another examiner, and the reverse as well. Another criticism that we received, particularly when we submitted these publications to scientific journals, the independent journal peer reviewers, anonymous, for a couple of our papers, particularly in the firearms, criticized the fact that we did not use other decision schemes like Bayesian approaches or likelihood ratios. They felt that that would have been the better way to do this. And we note in our response to concerns like that, that these are empirical studies of the current practice of pattern evidence examinations in the United States. They are not opinion pieces about what could be done or should be done. That is left to the court system and the individual laboratories, whether they want to move to other decision schema like Bayesian or likelihood ratios, but our research focused on assessing what is done rather than what could be done. One of our other challenges has been incomplete participation. Not every examiner participating in our studies evaluated every comparison and returned all the samples fully marked. So that is a challenge in evaluating the results. This really comes down to whether the incomplete portion, where they did not make the comparison, is missing at random or missing not at random, in which case maybe those more difficult samples might have been omitted. But again, we feel that we are in a fairly good position from that perspective because, frankly, nearly all of our samples were pretty difficult. Another criticism we've seen is a perceived insufficient opportunity to make false positives. False positives are what most people are interested and concerned about in terms of admissibility in court. And if one only had a small number of true non-matches, then obviously the participants would have fewer opportunities to make a false positive decision. And the rate of true non-match samples, which could be a candidate for a false positive, to true matched samples, which could be an opportunity for a false negative decision, they varied from study to study. But generally, the latter three, firearms, shoeprints, and handwriting, had a true non-match ratio of 2-to-1, where there were 2 true non-match samples for comparison for every 1 true matched sample. And in our most recent fingerprint study, that ratio is even a little bit greater. It's more like 80-20. Critics of the disciplines have said, quote, "It's easy to become an examiner." For our studies, we required them to be a, quote, "practicing examiner," to have been admitted as an expert witness and testified at trial. Whether or not it's easy to achieve that threshold is really up to the court system, not up to us as researchers. So participants who met those thresholds were welcome to participate in our studies. In the firearms study specifically, we also asked that they be from an accredited laboratory as well. Another assumption or assertion made about the participants in the study is that only the best or senior or most experienced examiners participated in these studies, and therefore that created a a lower bias for the error rates because they were the best examiners available. We believe this to be an unsupported assumption, and it's just as easy to assume the contrary, that the best examiners might be the busiest and most time challenged and therefore less likely to participate in the study. So again, I personally see lots of opportunities for that compensating phenomenology as well. And also, there's no guarantee that any one of these attributes, most experienced, most senior, are necessarily the best examiner. And then finally, it's really difficult to even represent what does best examiner mean. In a number of our papers, we look at the decision rates, the frequency with which a participant makes an absolute decision versus a qualified decision in which some degree of uncertainty is represented by inconclusive determinations. This next one is really sort of a very interesting criticism that I've heard once, maybe twice, from a very small number of people, obviously, about the honor system. So I mentioned those criteria for participation: practicing examiner, admitted as an expert witness in that discipline, and have testified. We relied on self-reported credentialing for that. We did not independently verify that our participants met those thresholds. And I've had at least one person opine that the possibility of deliberate malperformance is not zero, but we can neither prove nor disprove that. The idea that somebody would intentionally enroll in our research projects with the intent of doing poorly to harm the discipline. Personally, I think that's ludicrous, and I give it no credence. But for the sake of completeness, I thought I'd include it. And then finally, and perhaps most significantly, the topic that has generated the most dialogue, the most discussion at conferences and in papers is how inconclusives are treated. And it's bifurcated over time into how the inconclusives were treated in research versus the role of inconclusives in casework. So there's definitely an active and spirited discussion, which is a good thing, on whether inconclusives should be treated as errors in calculating things like accuracy, repeatability, and reproducibility, whether they should be allowed to be used in court. And I think we've seen the dialogue shift from inconclusives are intrinsically and always errors because there is a ground truth, to focusing in on the research studies themselves. Now, some critics have opined that because the researchers know ground truth, they should always be, that inconclusive decisions should always be treated as errors in the study. We don't necessarily agree with that, because even though ground truth is known to the researchers, ground truth is not known to the participants. So from that perspective, it's no different than casework, where an examiner's not going to know ground truth, and only the true guilty party knows that ground truth. Obviously, examiners, researchers, statisticians, the legal community all have different perspectives. It is definitely a challenge when organizational policies differ, because for our studies, we have to harmonize or standardize those conclusion scales. As I mentioned earlier, we've seen across our participating laboratories 2, 3, 5, 7, and 9 increment scales have been used. Three increment scales, probably the simplest to describe, right? It's an identification or an exclusion with an inconclusive in the middle. And then the 5, 7, 9 increments build on that inconclusiveness, where it might be an identification, strong evidence towards identification, but not enough to cross the threshold into identification, and so forth, and then mirror imaged on the exclusion side of the scale. We do essentially compel our participants to use a scale that is potentially unfamiliar to them, because we used either a 3 or a 5-point scale for most of the studies. And if you're in an organization that regularly uses a 7, then that's going to be unfamiliar to you, and then a little bit more uncertainty derives from that. When we talk about inconclusives, my colleague Austin Hicklin at AFS put it very eloquently that really what those inconclusives reflect is the individual risk tolerance for participating in examiners, whether it's research or casework, and how much information they feel they need in order to make a decision that is definitive, essentially an identification or an exclusion. And that risk tolerance is going to vary from individual to individual. There's been a lot of talk about, quote, inconclusive by design and incorporating such a category into research studies like this. It's an area we're spending a lot of time thinking about for future such studies, but that's going to be very difficult to create. And then finally, the last component related to inconclusives is how do we interpret data based on inconclusive decisions? So for our error rates that we've calculated and reported out, in the numerator, we put the number of correct final absolute decisions, identifications or exclusions in the numerator, and all decisions made in the denominator. That's how we get to the numbers I reported on the table a couple of slides ago. But in the interest of data transparency, we make all the data available so that if an individual wants to calculate a different error rate, and we've certainly seen some of this in our letters to the editors, to our publications, some blogs and Twitter posts and opinion pieces about whether the error rate could or should be as high as 30% if one puts all inconclusives into the numerator. That's a decision that others can make. We are reporting out on what we did and saw without any opinion, subjective opinion about what could or should not be done. Again, that relates to that individual risk tolerance. So to close with, I'd like to just make some acknowledgments. These were all very large team efforts. From an FBI perspective, it was a whole of lab enterprise. You can see representatives. These are the individual principal investigators on the various studies. As I mentioned, we did have subject matter experts from each of the disciplines, firearms documents, shoeprints, fingerprints, and so forth. Again, and I can't thank your organizations enough to allow the more than 500 external participants the time and the bandwidth to participate in studies like this. I know we are approaching research fatigue in black box studies, but again, we want to continue to improve. So with that, thank you very much. I'm going to stop the screen share, and I'm happy to take whatever questions I can.
Hey everyone, I'm Erin Forey from RTI International. Thank you so much, Jean, for being here with us today for that presentation. Super informative. We have lots of questions, so I'm just going to go ahead and get started. Why isn't voice biometrics included? Is it a pattern evidence?
Voice biometrics as a pattern evidence, that's not something the FBI laboratory does. So it was not as significant for us. We have a different part of the FBI that does voice analysis. And there's plenty of research going on. I'm aware of some similar studies done with facial recognition, but I'm not aware of any with voice. Fundamentally, it is a pattern, right? All instrumental techniques, in which case you're probably using something like an oscilloscope, and I might be reflecting my age in that. You get a squiggly line on a graph, that's certainly a pattern, right? But we have not done any research in that area.
Thank you. When choosing steel over brass for the firearm samples, was this done only to increase difficulty? And follow up to that, why not try to closely replicate casework when possible?
So the choice of steel-cased ammunition was to increase the level of difficulty. And again, that gets back to this concept of creating an upper bounding scenario. Let's just say, hypothetically, you had a 1% error rate using steel ammunition, which does take marks much less readily. Brass ammunition being softer, going to take marks in a more definitive way. So that should be captured by the 1% error rate on steel. So I think one can reasonably infer that a corresponding error rate for an easier substrate like brass would be less than that for steel. And why we didn't go with brass, as many other studies have done, was to, again, create that upper bounding scenario. And in a perfect world, where let's say we could define that exact 50th percentile of casework difficulty, and we got an error rate, and that error rate was, again, 1% for the sake of argument. In half of all casework, the half that is more difficult would not be bounded by that error rate. So it does, in my opinion, it has much less value to the court system in deciding whether or not that testimony should be admitted if the research study that is predicated on that 50th percentile level of difficulty does not represent that upper half of casework, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. I'm going to stick with firearms for a minute. Regarding the firearms study, have there been any efforts to see how algorithmic comparison methods perform on the sample set?
We have not yet. That is an area that we are interested in conducting future research on. Doing something with 3D virtual comparison microscopy, that's an area we're interested in pursuing. We could use the same samples that we used for the first study, scan them, image them, and use that for comparison purposes as well. So that's definitely an area in which we are interested in conducting future research.
For latent prints, do you feel that FNER would have been higher if it involved open searching of 10 print cards instead of the one-to-one presentation?
So we recently completed a second fingerprint study. We presented on that at the IAI conference last July and at American Academy meeting just a couple of weeks ago in December. That did not look at 10 print cards, but it looked at NGI. So next generation identification system. And we saw error rates very similar to those of the first study. Again, relatively low numbers, single digit percent, 10th percent, and errors dominated by one or more individual, but the specific results were very, very similar. I'm not sharing them here because that's still kind of pre-decisional, pre-publication. Once we publish those in the scientific literature, which we expect later this year, you'll see that those numbers are very similar. Or if you heard Joanne and Austin's talk in Denver earlier this year. Now that's NGI, not 10 print cards, but we see that it's pretty similar to the one-to-one presentation from the earlier study.
Can you review what type of agencies or how many different agencies were participants from?
So we generally did not have FBI examiners participate in the full study. FBI examiners generally participated in some early beta tests or pilot tests to make sure that our design was what we wanted it to be. But beyond that, in the full open studies, those number of participants that I showed in the table included other federal laboratories. So laboratories like ATF, DEA, Postal Service, Defense, as well as a very large number of state level and local jurisdiction crime labs. I certainly do not know the full number. I want to say it's around 70 different organizations represented throughout that. But we try to protect the identity of our participants, even through re-identification through aggregated data. So one of the constraints imposed by our institutional review board is we're not going to report any categorical findings if that category has fewer than 5 members. So if we only had one participant from Colorado Bureau of Investigation Laboratories, they're not going to be singled out, and we're not going to draw any findings on that because that would potentially, through all the metadata, lead to re-identification.
With respect to writing samples, are writing samples from identical twins known to be similar?
Yes, very much so. And if you read the paper, I think and I'm operating from memory, so I apologize if I don't have this exactly right. The error rate for false identification on twins was closer to 11%.
Is there any way to access ground truth for our results in the future if requested so as to be able to establish a personal error rate of some kind? or at least to learn from one's mistakes?
It's a great idea, and I applaud the person who asked the question for doing so, because that certainly indicates a desire to improve. From our perspective, we did not allow individual participants to become aware of their results because we did not want that to become giglio material in the event they did poorly. Other studies do make the results available to their participants.
Interesting. Were the errors per participant studied?
Not quite sure exactly what is meant, but in general terms, it's all participants' errors, meaning a false positive identification or a false negative identification, are in the numerator. So that is really just the total aggregate. And we see, despite having hundreds, roughly 170 for the fingerprint and firearm studies and roughly 100 for the shoeprint and handwriting studies, the number of individual errors is relatively low. So I think in the first fingerprint study, we saw one examiner make 6 errors or something on that order of magnitude. Most of the rest were individuals making 1 error each.
Okay, so the follow-up question were 1 or 2 people responsible for an artificially high error rate in any of the disciplines?
Yeah, yes, for fingerprints and firearms in particular.
Is there a way to sign up to participate in future studies?
Yes, when we conduct future such studies, we usually advertise through ASCLD, through IAI or other relevant professional disciplines in their newsletters and publications. We usually make recruiting pitches at the individual discipline conferences. So, for example, I went to a couple of the AFTI conferences to recruit firearms examiners. For the fingerprint study, we put notifications in the IAI news. So we try to get as much awareness of the possibility out as possible to make that participation as broad and hopefully representative as we can.
Isn't it also possible that some participants might render more errors under observation by virtue of overextending themselves while trying to demonstrate the extent of their abilities?
I think that is a perfectly valid observation. It's certainly possible. And unless we were to do the blinded studies, in which the participants did not know that they were working on research studies versus casework studies or casework comparisons, there's no way to parse out that phenomenology.
Please revisit the citing of 2014 court decision on handwriting involving cursive historically being more sound and now the mix of cursive and hand printing. Sorry, bringing research into question.
So in the Johnstead decision, the judge decided not to, if I'm recalling correctly, as it has been a while now, the judge decided not to admit the handwriting testimony because the admissibility argument was predicated on cursive writing, and the evidentiary materials were a mix of more common writing styles of today. And it did not impugn the handwriting discipline in any way, as I recall the way the decision was written, but merely questioned the validity of older research. And I say that, and I don't mean it to be as pejorative as it sounds, but that older research wasn't representative of more modern styles. Early research focused on all script cursive writing, Palmer penmanship, Spencer penmanship, versus, again, like I said, kind of my hybrid mixed style, because the handwriting comparison relies on the features associated with that writing to be able to make an individualization determination. So the court, I thought, reasonably asked whether or not it should be as admissible as it had been given the different writing styles. And I believe we showed that it should be.
Why was the accreditation requirement for participation only held to firearms and not to the other functional areas?
That was just a decision made for that study. No particular compelling reason that I can articulate. It's just that's what the research team decided at the time to include.
Sticking with the firearms study, were there indications of a correlation between false negative errors in the use of the CMS method?
I'd have to go back and revisit the paper on that. I apologize. I don't recall at the top of my head. So the CMS method is consecutive matching striations or stria. We did collect that as metadata. As I recall, we did not have a very large number of participants report using CMS method in making their comparison decisions. So I'd be hesitant to draw any inference from that based on a relatively small sample size.
Could you share the preliminary results from the newest black box study for latent prints?
As I mentioned earlier, it's very similar. I don't recall the numbers off the top of my head, and they are in the pre-publication process, although we have presented them at the American Academy meeting just a few weeks ago. But they're on very much the same order of magnitude as the initial study.
Did you, I think that I'm going to try to interpret this. Did you use fixed, holistic, or numeric approach of fingerprint identification during the study? Or did
No.
you fix holistic? I'm not really sure. I think there might be a typo.
Understood. So again, black box studies do not impose any particular methodology on the participants. So I'm inferring from the question the person is asking, did we ask participants to use some particular method or approach or scheme to evaluate? All we really asked was that they follow the ACE-V method. And we followed the conclusion scales from that. No value for identification. If it was value for identification, we had sort of the match, no match, can't tell, inconclusive categorizations. But we did not ask anybody to follow a specific method. Now, you might have noticed in that table, we had many, many more publications in the area of fingerprints. We did follow-on studies, a white box study that looked at the sufficiency, the quality and quantity of the information. We conducted an eye tracking study where we asked a subset of our participants to wear a device on their forehead that tracked the movement of their iris across the image comparison screen. So we could, and it sort of measures the dwell time on each pixel. So we could make some inferences about how much time they spent on a given region within a fingerprint. And again, these have all been published. So we looked at the clarity of the information. We have a lot more deeper understanding of what fingerprint examiners do.
Our last question, how can these studies be conducted in the field of fire and arson investigations?
So, and I'm not as familiar with that discipline. I think that there are two components based on what I do know. One is more the crime scene investigation, making observations at the scene of a crime versus the more analytical chemistry focused instrumental approach. The instrumental approach, I think, should be approached from a standard round robin type chemical analysis in which many toxicology, DNA, other fields have done round robin testing. We've organized and participated in those studies as well. I think for the crime scene focused, where one is making assessments of where a fire started and what the burn pattern is, I think it could be done. I think that's probably something that ATF would have a very strong interest in, or NIST would be well suited because they have burn houses that you could create a ground truth, known what happened, and then ask individual participants to come in and make that assessment of what the patterns of sequences of events and how the burn progression rate took place. And that's taken me right up to the edge of my comfort zone and knowledge of arson investigation. But I think something like that could be done. We are looking at a similar type of study with crime scene documentation that we're in the planning phases for, where we look at the tools that individual crime scenes used to document the physical location of objects and trajectories at crime scenes. And I think it would be something similar to that, where you have to create a physical environment that has the ground truth into which teams come and look at it. Obviously, much more expensive, much more logistically challenging, because you'd have to bring in all the participants to the burn house to look at it. And then you've got to figure out how to do that in a way that is not time dependent, because you've got to be able to take time out as an independent variable. But I'd love to help somebody design that study.
Yeah, well, any questions for Gene, you can reach out to him. His contact information will be available, as well as reach out to any of us at FTCOE. Gene, on behalf of ASCLD and FTCOE, thank you so much for presenting today. It was very informative, and we had really great questions from our audience. So thank you to our audience as well for joining us in our webinar.
Thank
We'll
you for
see
the
you next
opportunity,
time.
Aaron.
Thanks so much.
As you depart, we kindly ask that you take a minute or two to complete our post-event questionnaire. The link will be pasted in the chat and also appear as you exit the Zoom room. Your feedback helps us improve our outreach efforts and continue to provide the best experience possible. Thank you again for attending, and we hope everyone has a great day.